I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, and I'm the chair for the Center for Ethnographic Research. I want to welcome all of you to this presentation today. I want to thank a number of centers and also departments for co-sponsoring the event today. Berkeley Public Health has co-sponsored it, as well as the Department of Sociology and also the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. Now, I will inform everybody of the format which the talk will take today. Our speaker will address us for about 45 minutes. And after the completion of his talk, there'll be time for a question and answer period. And for those people who are on Zoom and joining us, you can go to the Q&A box and ask a question at any time. And at the time in which we are taking questions, I will ask the speaker to address your question on your behalf. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is an alum, really, of both the center and the Department of Sociology. Daniel Dohan is our speaker today. He received his AB from Harvard University in sociology, and he received his PhD in sociology here at University of California at Berkeley. Currently, Professor Dohan is professor in the Institute for Health Policy Studies, the School of Medicine at the University of California at San Francisco. He directs the Medical Cultures Lab, which seeks to understand medical culture and advance health equities. And it's a center that actually promotes research using ethnographic techniques in pursuing answers to its questions. Professor Dohan has published a number of technical pieces and is engaged in 2 long-term research projects. I will mention just 2. One, anticipating ethnic challenges and disparities in the dissemination of novel neurotechnologies. And the second, leadership to enhance aging research and innovation in medical culture. One of his papers, along with another of our alums, Corey Abramson, is a paper that has advanced methods, a particular method in doing ethnographic research that I want to call everyone's attention to. It is a method that allows quantification, actually, for direct observations. And particularly, it's important when you're doing a research project in which multiple numbers of people are on your research team, all observing behaviors, and the real question becomes what they see and how you make sense of what individuals see and whether they form patterns or not. This technique is called the array system, and has been published in sociological methodology, and I invite all the people who are engaged in this methodology to take a look at it and see whether it's appropriate for them. So, excuse me, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Dohan here, and as you can see from on the screen, this is the title of his talk, How to Heal Terminal Cancer, an ethnography of medical culture. Welcome.
Thanks, Martin. It's wonderful to be here. It's a little bit of a different environment than the Center for Ethnographic Research, where I spent most of my time as a graduate student and have visited since then, but very, very pleased to be here. And thanks for the introduction, Martin. I'm actually going to, later in the talk, show a brief example of an ethnoarray and hopefully bring that out. I'll just say that what I'm going to talk about today are some ideas that I've been working on for decades and thinking about for decades, but this is the first time I've really talked about them. So we're on thin ice here a little bit. So I'll look forward to hearing your feedback and comments, and especially which pieces of this resonate and which don't. I'm much more comfortable talking about methods, frankly, than substantive work, but I'm going to try to focus on the substance today, but we'll take every potential opportunity to digress into methods. So as Martine mentioned, where I hang out, the University of California, San Francisco is a health sciences campus. There's no division of humanities, or there are a couple of departments. There's a what used to be called the medical anthropology department, now is called the humanities and social sciences, and the social and behavioral sciences in the School of Nursing. Where I hang out is the medical cultures lab, which is in the School of Medicine. And we are a sort of a collective of people who are doing social science research with an emphasis on qualitative research. And as Martine mentioned, one of the things we're interested in is, as I mentioned here, sort of how can we enhance the impact of ethnographic research or participant observation research in medicine and health, where I think there are incredibly valuable contributions from these methods, but it's not in the same quantitative framework that has more weight in medicine and health. And then the other issue here is to provide insights that resonate across disciplines to improve equity and well-being. And I think this reflects one of the differences between the campuses, which is that UCSF as a health sciences campus tends to lean more towards applied and policy-oriented work. And my appointment is in the Institute for Health Policy Study as well, though Martine didn't mention that I'm also appointed in the Department of Surgery, which I think is pretty cool, but and maybe we'll talk about that later. So that's sort of to frame a little bit of where I'm coming from in all of the work I do. And in this particular project, because it's an applied series of projects that have strung together, and I should mention that the work that I'm presenting has been supported by a large number of grants over about a 20-year period. And everything I'm saying today is me and not the funders. And I have no conflicts of interest. That was on my title slide. But because it's applied, one of the things that I'm very interested in is for us to understand what we actually want to get from medicine and what medical culture should be doing from us. And I'm actually going to take a little bit of a throwback perspective on this by introducing or reintroducing one of the ways that Talcott Parsons conceptualized this question. And this was many years ago. And I should say this is from a review of the sociology of health and medicine. And this is what the author writes: Parsons' conception of the professions is clearly a normative and conservative one, which I think it is. Each profession was said to belong to one subsystem of society with its own set of norms, institutionalized rules, and patterns of relationships determined by culture. They applied their specialist skills and expertise by managing and controlling illness and other forms of social deviance, and essential to this role is a capacity for building trust, important if they are to carry out their work, whether this be attending to the souls of the congregation or healing the bodies of patients. In this way, the professions protect their patients or clients from market forces when they're at their most vulnerable. Now, Parsons thought this is actually how the professions worked. And I think following his work, in the 50s, there was a lot of criticism that this is actually not how the professions work at all. And I think that at this point, it's fairly well understood that that's not really how the professions work within sociology, but it would be nice if they worked that way. And I think part of what I'm going to be talking about today is, if this is what we want for medicine, how do we make that happen? What are the applications of sociological insights or other types of observations and data from ethnographic or participant observation research that could help us achieve this, if this is the idea of what we want? Which we can talk about if it's really what we want. So I'm going to also introduce why this might be an interesting question to think about at this particular historical moment. And I'm going to talk about sort of where we are focusing a little bit more narrowly on cancer medicine in the last 20 years and where the field stands in the last 20 years. And there have been a number of very interesting and important developments in sort of consolidations of understandings in cancer medicine in the last couple of decades since 2000. And that's sort of the more immediate context for the comments that I'm going to be offering a little bit. So one of the things that's happened is in the biomedical realm. And in general, the biomedicalization, the process by which medical knowledge is sort of infiltrates society and culture and shapes our bodies, has been seen as something which has numerous harmful effects for people. In cancer medicine, one of the ways that this has really manifested itself has been the development of precision tools, that is to say, biomedical knowledge of what's happening at a molecular level and how that plays out in shaping how cancer develops in our bodies. And for many, many decades, this was something that happened in the research laboratories and animal studies. But in 2000 to 2020, this actually became much more the reality in clinical medicine, and particularly around diagnosis and increasingly in treatment. And you see this actually throughout medicine, but in cancer especially. There are a lot of wonderful things about this in some ways, which I'll talk about. There are a lot of troubling things about this as well, which I'll also touch on a little bit as well. But that's one of the important contexts for these comments and why this is an interesting time to think about what we want medicine to do for us. So precision medicine moving from lab to clinic. A second issue is that the electronic health record has infiltrated the clinic and really represents the way that the business of medicine has infiltrated the clinic. Business of medicine has shaped medical practice for decades. But what's happened in the last 20 years or so is because of the electronic health record, it's now much more unavoidable in the everyday processes of care. And if you sit in a clinic today, you'll oftentimes see the clinician focused on the computer screen, and everything that happens in the clinic needs to be done in the screen on the computer for it to actually sort of count. These processes and programs are actually built for billing purposes, not for managing care, although increasingly they're looked at as ways to also improve the quality of care that's provided. The other thing that's been happening in the last 20 years is that the corporatization of medicine has resulted in some shifts in the organization of medicine that has been much more disruptive on everyday clinic life. So healthcare has been part of the business of healthcare has been with us for decades, especially since the 1970s. But really in the last 20 years has been when it seems like every couple of years the practice was sold. The person who provided your care somehow moved to a different insurance system. And these kinds of organizational changes in infiltration into clinic life became increasingly disruptive and unavoidable for patients. So those two trends, the electronic health record and how everyday care was structured, and then the disruptions that came from changes in the organization of corporate America have made market infiltration fairly complete over the last 2 decades in everyday clinic life. The final set of things that's happened has actually been on the side of equity. And this began basically back in the 90s when there were mandates for the inclusion of diverse subjects in biomedical research, and really continued through the 2000s with the passage of Obamacare, which expanded access to healthcare insurance for millions of people around in the United States. And then also in many, many initiatives around medical training and healthcare delivery services to improve equity and make providers more sensitive to issues of equity and inequality in medicine. So these are sort of 3 separate trends that have gone on in medicine over the last 20 years, and in some ways sort of frame some of the comments that I'll be making, but are going to be a little bit in the background. As I said, this is the first time I'm talking about these things, so I'm going to refer to these, and I encourage you to think about the way that these issues may be impacting on some of the things that I'll be talking about. So today, what I really want to think about is what is the work that medicine does to reduce cancer suffering. And because I'm a sociologist, I had to have a 2x2 table somewhere in the talk. There's a couple of things that medicine is doing that it's doing a somewhat better job at. And some of those things are living longer in cancer suffering. And I'm not going to talk about that much today because actually I'm focusing more on people with advanced stage cancer, and that's somewhat less relevant. Treatments are curing better than they used to, and I will talk about that a little bit today in the context of advanced cancer. On the other hand, medicine has been doing a pretty poor job at providing care that's accessible, affordable, and fair. And that's an enormously important and large topic on its own. And I'm mostly going to sidestep that today, although we could talk about that in the Q&A. A lot of what I'm going to be focusing on is the humanity of care and what makes cancer care humane for people with advanced cancer and the processes that allow that to occur, and to some extent inhibit that from occurring. So that's going to be a major focus of what I'm talking about today. I'm going to give you the answers before I go into the talk. So these are the kinds of things that I'm going to be focusing on I'll sort of circle back to these. Hopefully by the end of the talk, this will still seem like what I've talked about. It may not. So how healing happens in the last couple of decades. As I mentioned, targeted treatments and precision medicine have done a lot to eliminate cancer before it's terminal, but they also tend to jumble up understandings of what is curative treatment, what's palliative treatment, that is treatment that's going to help you feel better, but not necessarily eliminate the disease. What's an experimental treatment? What counts as tested and whatnot? And also what constitutes futile treatment? So targeted treatments, precision medicine, this molecular focus on disease has advanced things in many ways, but also confused a lot of categories that had been more stable before the 2000s. On the healthcare system side, I mentioned that the electronic health record and corporate reorganization have really penetrated the clinic, but it's created certain kinds of distractions and chaos and frankly, types of inanity in everyday clinic life that have in some ways created a common enemy for patients and caregivers and clinicians. And in that sense, it's created this shared experience of something that we can work against among everybody in the exam room. And it's kind of interesting that in some ways, I think that dynamic has become part of what occurs when people are actually healing from a terminal disease, this sense of fighting against an external problem that in some ways is more solvable than cancer that really can't be cured or stopped. And then on the third issue, equity is on the agenda. It's talked about a lot. It's talked about a lot among clinicians in research. It's talked a lot in the provision of care, but I would say that it's sort of talked at the level of two dimensions, at sort of a knowledge of privilege and oppression shaping the way cancer care is provided and the way that people benefit from care. But in terms of a 3D understanding of what, what these understandings mean for action and how it would shape interactions, that has not yet really been figured out. And I think that that has to do with, some of the ways that the medical profession has organized itself and the kinds of disciplinary commitments that the medicine profession has that it has difficulty moving away from. If doctors were better sociologists, this might be an easier task. On the other hand, sometimes I'm not sure sociologists are very good at doing more than sort of understanding this as a knowledge base. Shaping it into action is something that's quite challenging. So I'll talk about this a little bit as well, but a lot of what I'll be focusing on is these shared experiences of healing. So first, how healing doesn't happen. So treatments cure cancer better, but there's a way in which, even with these new treatments, the experience of cancer care still reflects the kinds of experiences that people have had for many decades, at least since the 70s. In this sort of overview of survivorship, it's discussed as the tripartite strategy of slash, burn, and poison, that is surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, remains a core aspect of contemporary cancer care. It also dominates the experience of survivorship. They say this is not to downplay the successes of oncological treatments over the last 100 years or so, but rather to emphasize the particular ways in which they frame disease and inflected illness experiences. And I think one of the things that we think about around for folks with advanced cancer, and I should take a step back, advanced cancer is the point at which cancer has spread throughout the body and typically is thought of as no longer being something that can be cured, and typically is thought of the thing that's eventually going to lead to an individual's death. It's a terminal condition. And we think about targeted treatments and precision medicine, and people get very excited about this. But the other piece of this that we're reminded of here is that these old forms, these brutal forms of treating cancer are still there, and still constitute a large part of the illness experience of people who eventually will get to the point where they have advanced cancer, because typically you go through treatments to get to that point. And really, I think it's fair to say, in many ways continue to dominate the experience of survivorship. At the same time, there's a way in which I think sociologists have been a little bit less sensitive than we could be to the advances of precision medicine, in the ways in which targeted treatments do tend to be less sort of devastating for patients. They do make the experience less debilitating than previous types of treatment. And I think there's a way in which we may also underestimate the extent to which patients appreciate having these treatments and truly experience them as beneficial. So that's something else we could talk about. So as I mentioned, I want to talk a lot about inhumane care, and I'm going to actually draw upon two works of recent anthropology. Well, one is not really an academic work, but a beautiful book by Anne Boyer, and the other is Lachlan Jane's book *Malignant*, which I'll actually be drawing on quite a bit in this talk. And I want to talk about two ways that they talk about inhumane care. And Martine mentioned that one of the things that the Center for Ethnographic Research is very interested in is doing participant observation, being attentive to patterns. And I'm going to use these two sources in a way because they're very rich explications of what happens. And I think one of the questions is, what do we do with this in terms of understanding the broader patterns of care? But I think they capture some of the things that we've also seen in our broader studies of cancer around inhumane care to begin with. So one has to do with this notion of isolation within neoliberal capitalism. And this is tied to a lot of work on healthcare and the way in which it's seen as sort of an individual issue, one's health. Anne Boyer writes, to tell the story of one's own breast cancer is supposed to be to tell a story of surviving by a neoliberal self-management. The narrative is of atomatized individual done right, self-examined and mammogrammed, of disease cured with compliance, 5K runs, organic green smoothies, and positive thought. And Lachlan Jane sort of builds on that. They say, by pointing out the different ways in which this sort of the individual is constructed and the ways that one is sort of constructed as a cancer patient and survivor. The game-faced survivor, this is one type, this is the Lance Armstrong, is the game-faced survivor, toughs it out, making the best of odds. And the good girl survivor, which is sort of the one that they mention as sort of standing in for a lot of people who are around breast cancer and sort of the pink washing issues, revels in narratives of the gift of cancer and the freedom to choose from among a range of treatments in hospitals. Of course, people want comforting images of cancer, and of course, people want to help. And of course, people always want to buy stuff. And I think that really captures these two ways in which the way healthcare has been sort of corporatized and turned in our neoliberal economy makes humane care difficult by isolating us. The second way that inhumane care occurs is through what I'm going to call inadequate scaffolding. And I'll try to tie this back to some sociological concepts of how culture operates, if I can figure out how to express them. But this is also from Lachlan's work. I have a piece of the quote here. I have a longer thing here. I have a lot of, I've not done a very good job of turning this into a medical talk. There's a lot of words here. As with financial planning and choosing a partner, one doesn't learn how to speak to a physician in school. Still, that interaction in less than a few minutes can change the course of your life. It doesn't help that on the doctor side, little medical training focuses on how to handle the fraught social exchange of an office visit. If determining when and where cancer exists takes skill and time, and a system pressed for time, being a good communicative patient also takes practice, though the literature on cancer diagnosis rarely touches on how this relationship, usually between strangers, bears on diagnostic procedures. I had no idea how to talk to a doctor. So maybe in this case, the misdiagnosis was my own fault, which is part of that neoliberal issue and responsibility. But I'd gone in for a specific request, a biopsy, based on a concrete symptom. In fact, several years after that interaction, I met another woman who'd had nearly exactly the same situation. She also had a fine needle aspiration that came out negative. However, her doctor had a 6-month follow-up policy, and so an accurate diagnosis shortly followed. And I think part of what Lachlan has captured here is the way in which, for many people in cancer, this is a completely different terrain, a novel universe that they have no experience with. And one of the things that we've noticed by following patients over time is that terrain constantly shifts. And there's learning that occurs at the beginning of the terrain, which may have relevance later, but there's always new things that occur. And so, although here they're thinking, is there something that I could have learned? Could I have learned in school how to talk to a physician? I think part of this is a type of learning which is very experiential. It's around practice. It's deeper than just a knowledge. And because it involves the body and because it involves serious issues of emotions, it's an extremely difficult type of learning to convey. It's a learning that occurs through actually the body being changed. So this inadequate scaffolding for patients is one of the other ways in which cancer care tends to be inhumane. But the same can be said of what's going on the clinician side of the exam room table. And this is from Ann Boyer. And anyway, I'll read this and I'll try not to let myself get distracted, but I'm going to get distracted. On a scrap of yellow paper, the oncologist wrote, hormone receptive positive breast cancer, explaining that there were targeted treatments for it, and then crossed it out. And what's happened here is, right, the oncologist, and then literally crossed it out on the piece of paper. Then he wrote, HER2 positive breast cancer, explaining that there were targeted treatments for it, then crossed it out. Then he wrote triple negative and explained that there were no targeted treatments for it, accounting for between 10 and 20% of breast cancers. It has the fewest treatment options and significantly poorer prognoses than others, responsible for a disproportionate number of breast cancer deaths. He said, this was the cancer I had. He said the tumor was necrotic, which meant that it was growing so quickly, it failed to build infrastructure for itself. He wrote down 85% for the tumor's growth rate, and I asked him what that meant. He told me that a Ki-67 score of anything over 20% was highly aggressive. He then said neoadjuvant chemotherapy, which meant right away. I didn't agree to dissect any nodes or biopsy the other potential areas the doctors feared were tumors. This one certain tumor was bad news enough. And its treatment would be so aggressive, I felt that there wasn't any point in a painful intervention to know what else was there. So this happens all the time in cancer care. It happens actually throughout medicine. I'm involved in a project now, which is looking at the integration of palliative care into surgery, which is why I wanted to, flaunt my surgical chops, although never let me do surgery on you. And this is actually one of the things that we've talked about in our research team, that there's a way in which, particularly for surgeons who like to draw pictures of what they're going to do procedures on, in one of the people on our team who is a surgeon in training herself said, I don't know why we do that. No one ever learns anything from these pictures. We just do it for ourselves. And I thought that was a remarkably insightful thought on this process. And this really does happen all the time. And anyway, pictures have been a very interesting part of how we understand medicine, and the sort of visualization of disease is an incredibly important topic. But this really captures a way in which the clinician's understanding of that and their use of imagery is not sufficiently scaffolded around patients' experience, and making that connection between what they understand from the technical pieces they're learning and what patients are ready to understand in their experience with illness. So how does healing happen? I'm going to talk about a couple of different ways that this happened. This is from Arthur Kleinman, who is a physician at Harvard Medical School. And this is a book from, it says 2020, but it actually was published originally many, many years ago. So like Talcott Parsons, in some ways, Arthur Kleinman is a giant of the field whose ideas maybe are not exactly seen as the cutting edge at this point. But for an applied project, for people who want to sort of think about what could help move the conversation forward in a interdisciplinary way, his ideas, I think, are still quite relevant. So what he says is, I'm going to set out a practical clinical method that clinicians can and should apply to provide more effective and humane care of chronically sick persons. This alternative therapeutic approach originates in the reconceptualization of medical care as empathetic witnessing of the existential experience of suffering and practical coping with the major psychosocial crises that constitute the menacing chronicity of that experience. I'm going to skip over and just touch on a couple of words here. The assembling of a mini ethnography of the changing context of chronicity, informed negotiation with alternative lay perspectives on care, and brief medical psychotherapy. So these are some of the things that he argues are needed for adequate clinician scaffolding. Now, it's worth thinking back on what's happening to our healthcare system and the extent to which this vision is at all conceivable in our current healthcare system, which is dominated by the electronic health record and organizational rearrangement to maximize profits, but still worth keeping in mind as one vision for how humane care might occur. This is from Lachlan Jane. They write, after my cancer treatment, I had bottles of pills I could sell on the street for hundreds of dollars, a couple of round cloth envelopes, each stuffed with an adjustable fake cotton puff and fastened with Velcro. A huge gel prosthesis drooped over the edge of the shelf. This is what they find in their closet as they're moving out of their parents' house after completing treatment. A used wig, which I had selected at the cancer center from a massive mound but never really wore, poked out from a manila envelope like a squirrel sniffing for danger. The cancer fracas had curated this tiny, now anachronistic collection. The objects in this uncanny heap had served not merely as isolated stand-ins for a body, but as crucial conduits for some semblance of a social life, for a normalcy that was by no means assured. They deciphered me. They enabled me to partake in life among friends and strangers, or at least to imagine the possibility of doing so. So again, back to Parsons' original conception of this, what we would want medicine to do, and other theorists of his, E. Evans Pritchard also spoke of this, is it's a way to socially reintegrate people who have experienced illness or other misfortune. And I think this speaks to, as Lachlan describes it, it's sort of detritus that sort of facilitates that social reintegration. And I have some more from that section, but I'm going to move along. So that's one aspect of, what are the things that we do to keep ourselves going during the illness and maintain our social connection. And this is another reflection from Lachlan's work. Right before my diagnosis, I entered the academic job market. I was offered a bunch of interviews, all but 3 of which I gave up, not seeing how I could do a good interview while on chemotherapy. One I really wanted to try for, but I couldn't seem to fit the interview in between my various treatments. I requested the last possible day for the interview. And as the time grew near, I wrote saying that I was under, quote, medical watch. I didn't want to mention the C word. And so could not travel. After all, was there any chance they could change the interview date? Yes, they would postpone it by 4 days. So I lobbied my radiation oncology for an early start to the daily treatments, and he doubled them for 3 days so that I could be finished in time. I did the interview with about 3 eyebrow hairs, radiation burns, barely hidden by my collar, and 3 millimeters of hair on my head. Despite my weariness, it was fun, the perfect way to celebrate the end of that set of treatments. If that doesn't clinch my qualification as a dyed-in-the-wool academic, what does? And one of the things that they mention here is lobbying their radiation oncologist to shift the treatment. And this is something that we see very commonly in cancer care, and especially for folks with terminal cancer, adjusting treatment to accommodate other things that people want to do in their lives, meaningful things. In some ways, that's that pushback against the corporate medicine that schedulist everything this way. It's also an interesting pushback against biomedicalization in general, and this sense of our bodies as being these sort of finely tuned machines that have to be addressed and touched just this way in order to be fixed. Here, Lachlan Jane actually does recover from their cancer, but in folks with advanced cancer, of course, that's not going to happen. And so this issue of like how people lobby and maneuver their treatments to make it work for their larger life experiences, it's a very interesting and important part of how healing happens. And then this is a final thought about healing, again, drawing Lachlan Jane. The whole experience of cancer, attending the look good workshop, wearing the wig, not wearing the wig, having the port put in and having it taken out, trying on the prosthetic breast and taking it off, was a process of figuring out how and where and when to pass within a slew of identities and communities, as whole, as gendered, as job-seeking, as non-threateningly queer, as healthy. In a way, these tensions mirrored that life as usual. In another way, I had to come to terms with the full force of the work that all cancer patients do each day to stay within their various social crowds. Social lives depend on these norms, and people maintain the norms by everyday acts of passing. So if looking good might be dismissed as superficial, using precious energy to put on lipstick can also be understood as an act of intense resistance to the social exclusions that many people with cancer suffer. And again, I think this is another aspect of how healing occurs. This whole notion of being forced to confront with one's identity and decide in a very ongoing and day-to-day way to what extent one is going to be a cancer person, associated with illness, not associated with illness. And this is also part of what happens during healing. So I wanted to share, that was a lot. And I wanted to share that because honestly, given where I am in this project, Ann Boyer and Lachlan Jane do a much more thorough and beautiful job of describing some of these dynamics than the data I'm about to present now, which is rather still unprocessed. But let me tell you a little bit about the projects that in the primary data that are going to inform, and I'm going to be presenting just the teeniest slice of this. So this work reflects field work that went on for about almost 20 years, starting about the year 2000. There were 3 separate projects that had slightly different foci. One of the wonderful things about being on a health sciences campus, well, I should say, one of the horrible things about being on a health sciences campus is that you don't have a job. You have to get research grants to fund your position. One of the wonderful things is once you get a research grant, you can sort of do what you want with it within some reasonable boundaries. So even though these were 3 separate projects and supported by 5 or 6 different grants, there are threads throughout them that I was able to follow the entire time and sort of accumulate a body of observations and insights that that inform the analysis I'll be presenting. The downside is it wasn't all exactly systematic and as we would want, but there we go. So one study really focused, this was a pilot study that focused on just cancer and culture in general. A lot of this work occurred in the safety net setting, that is where folks who at the time where this study began did not have access to health insurance, this was pre-Obamacare, received cancer care. Field notes, a number of interviews, some focus groups. A second study was, for me, a very important study because this was an opportunity to go into a private practice, nonprofit clinics, where I was able to do observations in 2 private practice clinics and field notes and interviews. This was a somewhat shorter duration, but still very informative for understanding how things looked in private practice. Most research occurs in academic medical centers, and so that was very helpful. But what I'm going to draw on mostly is the cancer patient deliberation study, which was which occurred in many subspecialty clinics and a couple of different academic centers in different regions of the country. This was a large team project. I did field work, but many other people also did field work. It's a very large data set. We've done a lot of different types of analyses with it, which we can talk about at some point if that's of interest. But that's really, I'm going to focus a little bit there and just provide a very small slice of some of the findings. And some of this is going to look familiar to people in the audience. So findings in 4 ways. I'm going to present 3 different patients and slightly different types of data for each of the different patients. And we may want to think about what it means to have, how are we doing for time, Martin? Oh boy, we better go fast. All right. So this is an analytical memo, patient named Daisy Rohr. This is basically a story. Daisy Rohr told her doctor about the cough in 2004, but it'd be 4 years before a different doctor called to say, you have to come in, and gave her the dreaded news that she had esophageal cancer. Battles over insurance coverage delayed the tests and consultations she needed for an accurate diagnosis. mean, typically, cancer of the esophagus presents near the stomach or high near the throat, but they had trouble finding Daisy's because it was in the middle. But perhaps it shouldn't have been such a difficult call because, as Daisy noted, they said this is very common with Asians. Then her treatment began with a surgical misadventure, and so when we met Daisy in 2012, the cancer had metastasized and cure was impossible. Her treatment options had dwindled, and she'd lived for only another year. As her physical health declined, she grappled with which tests and which chemotherapies to agree to and which to decline. She struggled to communicate to her oncologist and her family that she had accepted the inevitability of her death, and through observations of her visits to the oncology clinic and hours of interviews with her and her husband, we watched and listened as she, her oncologist, and her family quietly and implicitly came to share this acceptance. And I think one of the issues that's brought up here is this issue of learning from experience and going through the experience of illness. And in this case, Daisy sort of got someplace where she had to wait for others to arrive, both bringing her clinicians who arrived there fairly quickly as she began to express her reluctance in subtle ways about her reluctance to receive more treatment. But her family took longer. Her daughters came along relatively more quickly. Her husband was the really difficult person to bring on board. And because she didn't want to disrupt the relationships within her family, this actually delayed her ability to sort of get to the point where she wanted to be in terms of the intensity of care. And that was an incredibly important part of her healing process. This is Lou Linder. This is more of a data memo. It's not quite as narrativized. In 2008, a liver transplant failed to stem Lou Linder's bile duct cancer, which soon reappeared in his pelvis and lymph. His oncologist recommended chemotherapy. In an interview in the summer of 2011, he said, "I asked my neighbor, who's a kidney transplant surgeon, and he consulted with, I think, 4 or 5 other doctors. Half of them told me to go for the chemotherapy, and the other half, including the liver transplant surgeon, not the one who actually operated on me, but one of them who's on the team, they told me don't even bother to go for chemotherapy because I could just live out the last few months in comfort instead of suffering. But I decided to go for it, and after 6 months, that tumor was subsided." By fall 2012, chemo and radiation had kept the cancer at bay for 4 years, but a scan still showed a 2-centimeter tumor on Lou's liver. During a routine visit with his oncologist, Lou asked, "Could I have surgery again?" The oncologist shakes his head and explains that when you have metastatic disease like this, surgery is definitely not the right choice. Chemo is more appropriate, and Lou has had a good response. Lou notes that it's still spread, and the oncologist responds, "I don't think the chemo will cure this." Lou asks about a clinical trial. His oncologist says that they can consider a trial, but it might be tricky because of Lou's transplant. The trials have specific guidelines that have to be met. We have a legal and ethical obligation not to put some patients on because of safety. But if the other option is death, asked Lou, being on a trial might hasten death. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Lou actually ended up doing all kinds of things without telling anybody that he was doing them. Getting experimental treatments, traveling for treatment, not telling his oncologist what he was doing, not telling his family or his wife what he was doing. He had a very different sense about what it was to heal, and it was to be extremely aggressive, extremely focused on sort of therapies, and he was able to pursue those things. So that for him was this other notion of healing, which was very much aligned with pursuing options, consulting with an elite social network, reading the medical literature, etc. This is an interview transcript with Delbert Leonette, different type of data. If you don't mind my asking, what did you think when the doctor said that it was time to try something new? I was saying, I mean, like when they said that, it was like, I hope this one works since the other one didn't work, and yeah. And I was telling my wife, I said, well, we've got to keep going to it until we get the right one. That's all. We have to be patient. She said, well, we have to keep going. Well, we just have to keep going, So I didn't ask you about the relationship with your doctor. How have things been going with your doctor? He's treating me good, He explains things to me, and lets me know, because he told me before I can't get rid of it, but they're going to try to keep me living for a little while anyway until they can find something to keep it down or something, That's why he came here today, If I didn't think that he was going to do what he's trying to do, I wouldn't be here today. I'd just say, hey, he's been telling me this now for a year and it ain't working, but you've got to be patient. Like my mom used to say, be patient and wait for something good to come. So this again is a very different way of understanding what's involved in healing. I should also mention that for Delbert, his daughter and his wife were much more engaged in thinking about what treatments would be appropriate and how to pursue care. And he tended to be, as this interview transcript reflects, a little bit less engaged and willing to let things move ahead without his active engagement in it. So Daisy, Lou, and Delbert all faced these difficult choices of incurable illness, but it's clear that they navigated these circumstances in somewhat different ways. As I mentioned, Daisy's family wanted her to try everything available, but she was wary of that. Lou responded aggressively to each new twist the disease threw at him, often keeping his clinicians and family in the dark. And Delbert kind of waited for the situation to come to him, with his wife and daughter tending to be more knowledgeable and more concerned about the disease than he. All of these things happen in sort of very complex social processes, especially in the situation with Delbert, where the oncologists would sort of circle around the three of them and sort of check in turn with what was going to be the way forward. But that was a very common thing that we see in the exam rooms in all of these cases. So as I mentioned, this is the ethno-array, which is sort of capturing, this is for a different group of folks. This is for, it's sourced from the Cancer Patient Deliberation Study. This is for a smaller group of folks who have advanced melanoma, a different type of cancer. And one of the things that we did was took all of these data, coded them in a traditional way that one does with qualitative data, and then looked analytically for correlations between different types of codes in the data and then displayed these visually. And this is a fairly crude picture, but what I wanted to point out is that statistically, there are two groups that fall out from looking at these data, which are associated with really two different styles of making decisions. And what's notable and what's driving the difference between these groups is in group A, that upper, let's see, this area here, there's less, the dark areas are areas where there are sort of indications in the data that people are doing things, and the light areas are not. This is what's driving the statistical algorithm to divide the two groups. And some of the things that are different here is the role in treatment conversations. Group A is less involved. They tend to have less high involvement. Around information seeking, they're not tending to look for multiple consults, and they're not tending to look for second opinions compared to the people in group B. And for medical knowledge, they're tending to rely on the patient and network more in group B than in group A. So these are sort of some statistical things that we've noticed in the observations and the coded data. And we sort of distinguish these different styles as one being an active insider, that's the larger group, the group B, the people who really try to be deeply involved in their care. These are the Lou Linders out there. This is Daisy's family. This is Delbert's family, who want to know all about the treatments and the options and be very much involved in thinking about what's the right thing for them. But there's another group, the reliant outsiders, and this may be a little bit more like Delbert, who are willing to sort of let the oncologist and their clinician guide them along and to take their opinion and follow it. We've presented this here, and I actually don't know why we didn't sort this a little bit more to make it a little more easier to read. But one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that some of the standard demographic characteristics don't do a great job of explaining these different styles of decision making, and that's not surprising, right? How the style in which we make decisions are extremely complex things, and they're the kinds of information that I think we want to know when we think about how to make medical care work. But also are very difficult to find out without actually spending time and watching what happens in the clinic and seeing how people actually work through the process of making decisions, because there's such complicated dynamics and they change over time. So, so here's again how healing happens. Targeted treatments eliminate cancer before it's terminal, but they distract from healing by jumbling cure, palliation, experiment, and futility. And we see this all the time in the exam rooms, where there's this jumbling of why are we doing this, and not just jumbling in terms of objectively, but different people in the exam room thinking that different types of treatments are offering different types of outcomes. So that's the jumbling, not simply confusion, but the jumblings of different voices and perspectives. I talked a little bit about the distractions and the chaos and the inanity of healthcare markets and the creation of that the experience that creates that shared experience among patients, caregivers, and clinicians. And again, I want to go back to the experience that Lachlan Jane describes of bringing their radiation oncologists on board. And that, again, was one example of this. We saw this a lot with Daisy in her experience also, where shaping the way that treatments are provided as a way to make better aligned with healing, even if that's less aligned with what the standards processes should be. And we can talk more about equity. As I said, I think it's on the agenda. It's not something I talked about a lot in this talk, but in terms of its ability to really drive in a deep understanding way what's happening in the exam room, it seems like the profession has a long way to go in that respect. And it's not clear to me that the tools are even there within the medical profession, given the professional commitments to make that happen. So I'll end with maybe some thoughts about what could be helpful in this kind of work. I think ethnography, participant observation, and sociology actually can do a lot to improve the scaffoldings for healing. And again, those scaffoldings are the issues about how people are coming to interactions together, how they're reaching across to each other and connecting and finding common ground to make decisions and have a shared understanding of what's happening with terminal cancer. There's an avalanche of data and computing power now in medicine that's driving a lot of decision making. It's driving algorithms, it's driving what clinicians see and what they do. And yet it doesn't capture the narratives of care. It doesn't capture those internalities of care. And partly that's because those are not captured in the electronic health record. Partly that's because people don't necessarily show it or share it, even when you ask them explicitly. But when you see how people behave, and especially over time, when you see how people's deal with their illness over time, ethnography is able to really advance our understanding of these narratives of care, the narratives both that people construct, but also how they reconstruct it as they go along. And medicine endorses equity and well-being, yet it has limited tools and honestly limited creativity to do so. And I think there's a lot of sociological insights about how medical institutions and institutions in general work that could be translated into interventions to improve strategies of care. The irony here is sitting in a health policy institute, a lot of these creative thoughts and ideas have actually entered the field of medicine, but mostly on the side of health policy and more on sort of the organization of medicine as opposed to the everyday practice of it. And because of the limitations of the market economy and how it constrains our choices for how healthcare is delivered, creativity is incredibly important for coming up with viable ways to make scaffolding more easily buildable and to connect clinicians and patients and caregivers in the process of making healing happen. I'll stop there. Thank you.
There are a number of questions. Some are Zoom questions, and of course the audience may have questions as well. And I'll kind of interact them, but I guess I'll start myself. And one of the slides up there, there is this term used that associated certain kinds of practices with neoliberal sorts of ideas. But my question to you is, in order to actually sustain that, we'd have to have a comparison thing that was something non-neoliberal to know whether it was neoliberal, or could you imagine another system that would have something different than that, in which we would study, which, you know, in previous times, some socialist or communist sort of system, because otherwise we don't know whether it's actually neoliberal or just part of the human condition about where somebody is standing.
Great question, Martine. And I guess, so the way in which I was invoking neoliberalism there, I think, was around one of the issues around what makes healing hard in the way that it's difficult for people to, I'm trying to remember the exact word I used, and I'm gonna look back on my slide. around inhumane care, right? And I think the way that this has been evoked around a neoliberal, which is generally associated with sort of a capitalist system, an economy, and it's this sense of isolation and personal responsibility. And perhaps I could have said, rather than neoliberal isolation, I could have said that sort of an understanding of personal responsibility for one's health and treatment. I think it's possible to do cross-national comparisons and look for the extent to which this is more or less strong across different societies that might help get a sense of whether this is neoliberalism or just the human condition. And I think there's an extent to which serious illness and terminal illness is a powerful aspect of the human condition. And it would be probably improper to attribute all the isolation to our economic system and the way that we've organized our society. But on the face of it, there's such an enormous number of, I mean, Lachlan James says, of course, people always want to buy stuff. So there's associations, which are not causal relationships, but the associations are powerful. That is to say, the associations between the way the healthcare system operates and the profits that are extracted from it, the investments that are made in it. And I think those associations are what suggest that it's okay to call this a neoliberal aspect of our system.
But I guess maybe I didn't articulate this well, but I think this is really, I think it's an important part. If the idea is it's neoliberal, and the idea about individualism about neoliberal, and I have a disease, and the question becomes, is the actual issue of my individualism is based on some kind of ideology that's based on the economic system, or is it really based on the fact that I actually have this disease and nobody else has the exact disease? So I'm trying to figure out how one would actually see this as not being just me and sharing it in some kind of particular kind of way. How is it not like an individual thing? It's not like my son, my wife doesn't have this disease. I have this disease. How is it not? How could it be non-individual? I guess, or that's the competing thing. It's a disease as opposed to kind of how does the ideology make it an individual neoliberal? That's what I think is the challenge.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So I guess, my fundamental assumption differs. I actually don't think disease is an individual experience. It's inevitably social. And so part of what I'm referring to in neoliberal isolation is you take that social experience of disease, right? This is what Parsons said. The issue isn't whether an individual has a disease, it's how it interferes with their ability to socially interact and how it represents a form of social deviance. So the question is, confronted with that social deviance, with a break in the social order, whether that's caused by disease or witchcraft or whatever you may call it, is that understood broadly as an individual condition, or is that understood as a shared condition? And I think what I'm referring here is that those types of experiences in this country tend to be understood as an individual experience. The individual causation, responsibility, et cetera. And I think that's what's captured in this notion of this first type of inhumane care, is there could be a way in which that social experience of difference is not handled as an individual responsibility.
Okay, now I have a number of questions, and I think I should take a Zoom question first, and then we'll go back to the audience. And I'll do the best I can in terms of quoting. The question is, I'm wondering above the choice to privilege, the works of Ann Boyer and Lachlan Jane. These are wonderful, politically important books, but the authors are both white, upper middle class people with a great deal of social capital. Given the inequities in cancer treatment, how might the key issues look different if the texts selected for close analysis and theory building were not anchored by such powerful subjects?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. It's a limitation of where I am in the analysis, and I think that that I drew on those texts because, and they are privileged. There's a way in which these texts are very articulate about certain dynamics of cancer, and I think that the goal is to understand, and as I go through the project, what some of those other issues arise, and in which ways those experiences are a reflection of privilege, in what ways they are sort of one expression, but there are other ways of expressing the experience of cancer that also need to be forefronted. I think one of the really, and this goes back to the question you asked a little bit, Martine, right? The experience of illness is one of extreme subjectivity. And one of the challenges is, how do we express that subjectivity? How do we share that subjectivity? And it's not something that is necessarily equally distributed within society, and is something that's more, I think, associated with privilege, that sense of, I'm going to express that my experience is worth expressing and getting out there. It's an absolutely valid question, and hopefully something that I'll address in the future.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'll also introduce myself. I'm at UCSF as well. I'm a sociologist in the Social and Behavioral Science Department. So it's exciting to see you presenting ethnography, and I'm really and I have personal residence. I have a ton of cancer in my family, and so maybe this sort of builds a little bit on that other question too. But I have a lot of patient as a chronic illness patient, interacting with medical providers. I've been a caregiver to my father, and in my own work about older adults, I've spent a lot of time doing ethnography, trying to understand, like, they will sort of debrief each other, like, what happened at the doctor's office. And so there's a lot of that resonated with my own work and my interest in kind of decision making and networks and peer support. And so one of the things that I feel is so pervasive, just in my own personal experiences and professional experiences in these medical spaces, is time, and how constrained time is. And of course, you discussed the market forces that are at play. And years ago, there was a wonderful dissertation defense I attended through the medical anthropology program, whatever the name is now, called Patients Are Waiting. And it was a doctor, MD, PhD in medical anthropology. And so I'm just wondering, in the sense of, patients are waiting, and just more and more, I feel like there should be like a stopwatch when you enter like a doctor's office to know exactly how much time do you have, and you're only allowed, I've been told you're only allowed to discuss like this many things in this appointment. And I think that that's so key to the kind of the equity question, what do you do when you're having cognitive issues, when you're not skilled in talking to people of privilege, when English may be your second language. And that's the circumstances under which I attended many doctor's appointments with my father, having to kind of do this work of translation into very complicated English into simplified English. So I just love your thoughts about, not solve it all in 30 seconds, sure, but what can we do about this sort of mundane issue of time, but it's so key to having those narrative discussions.
Yeah, it really such a crucial issue, and I have trouble staying on track, honestly, just talking about this project. So I was interviewing a clinician this morning, actually an orthopedic surgeon, and he was, and this is for a project on the integration of palliative care into surgery, I think you referred to previously. And he was talking about, he has 30 patients a day. And one of the things that he does, he's a thoughtful senior person, very experienced. And one of the things he does is which I mentioned here too, right? He sort of shifts his time, and he gives more time to people who need more, in his sense, who need more time, and less to people who need less. And he recognizes that there are scripts that people come into the office with, and he recognizes that the whole clinic is set up so that his physician assistant comes in and talks more about the psychosocial stuff, and he sort of describes himself as sort of the closer, and he knows once he comes in, but then he also could draw on his experience to say, and then these are the circumstances in which I will, in a sense, steal from others to use more time there. And that's not a solution. I mean, obviously this is a structural problem in medicine, but for me that highlights two issues. One is the clinical judgment about which patients to steal time from and which patients to give time to. And I think in some ways that works against what we would want from an equity perspective. I have sat in oncology offices where, the conversation goes on and on about vacations and cars and boats. And meanwhile, there are people waiting in the other exam rooms. So, right, so that's one of these issues where the alignment of privilege from the medical professional and the patient sort of works against what we would hope. So one issue is that issue of professional judgment. And then, the second issue is really this issue of the extent to which there's a recognition of this common enemy of the way that the medical system has been set up and corporatized, and what types of opportunities that could provide for interventions that would allow for better attentiveness to these issues. But in some ways, the first issue is more daunting. That is to say, how do you create that professional judgment and sense of how to appropriately respond to patients who are less powerful, less privileged, and do so in a way that's humane, that's appropriate, and consistent. So, yeah, I solved it in 30 seconds.
Gave me more to think of, so I appreciate it.
Dan, could you talk a little bit more about how you define healing? Because you gave, I'd like to get a better, I kind of glimpsed it, but I'd like to hear more.
Yeah, I'm struggling with it. And this is also partly why I drew on the pieces that I did, because I feel like those, Ann Boyer and Lachlan Jane, actually have thought about their experience and have reflected on it and are in a position where they're able to use books and words to talk about it. So I do see it as happening across a number of different dimensions. And one has to do with, how one is navigating the actual experience of illness and how one is presenting oneself in relationship to others as they do so. I think another has to do with, some of the issues around not in relation to people that one's close with, but sort of within broader society, and how one is thinking about one's relationship of the self to the broader society, and keeping those relationship and sense of self intact. And then one has to do with, where people are thinking about what they want to see as an outcome and what's going to happen to them personally as they go forward. I don't know what it is, to be honest with you. That's partly what I'm struggling with right now, is what healing actually is. I do have this sense that it is, has to do with some type of social reintegration through the experience of illness, in that happens across multiple domains and dimensions, and that people struggle with it.
Thank you. It's a great project, and very, very intense. I have problems also with definitions, with healing versus cure. And I have problems, and even terminal. What is terminal? We have studies, where the important thing is when is somebody dying. Sharon Kaufman's work, no, Jessica. And this whole thing with narrative, I did a whole study on palliative care in Italy, and people were in different stories. One was accepting, as you were saying, like the family. One was accepting that he was dying, and the family was in another story. And another issue is who is the patient, or who gets priority. In Italy, it's not, and Japan, it's not necessarily the patient. And it's very interesting. I just think a lot of, this notion of cure and healing, as someone said, she expects to be cured. That's her expectation, which is medical promise in so many ways. Anyway, it's very interesting and provocative, and I'll leave it at that.
And I think in some ways, right, I've taken this thing, healing, as a dependent variable, but I don't know what it is, and I can't define it very well. So that's not a very good place to start a study. But partly what I'm thinking about in the project is, the issues that I think that you raise in your work, and that in general I feel like medical anthropologists raise in their work of global ethnography, have to do with these profound experiences of human what is the human experience of illness, and how do those narratives vary, and especially how do they engage with and interact around, the dominant biomedical structures that really globally shape the way healthcare is provided. And there are a number of really important issues around that within the United States context, within the context of health policy, within the idea of how do we make this better here. That's partly why I'm trying to think about these three sort of layers, that, what's happening in precision medicine and how is that disrupting and shaping healing, what's happening with the corporatization of medicine, and then to what extent are these movements for bringing more attention and energy and resources to issues of health equity, to what extent are those things successful or not, and what might be strategies to make them more successful and more responsive to people's actual needs and experiences. And I feel like that's part of how I'm sort of setting up this problem and making it a little bit less than trying to boil the ocean. And it's against the context of medical anthropology, where there is, just a richness and understanding of variability that's always going to escape the sort of, the structures I'm trying to put around these types of analyses.
I have another question, which I'm a little confused about. And that's the dependent variable of what's being explained. If we take actually a word, healing, it's an action, it's a verb. But it's not, it's not something that actually is an endpoint in which you're explaining in some particular kind of way. So I guess I go back to a number of other issues. Are the cure, that's clear, if we're actually, if the dependent variable, we're explaining the cure, because healing is a process that is infinite. And there's no way to actually have some kind of judgment about whether it's occurred or not. So I don't know that a project like this could actually end up saying much about what healing in this particular way, because it's too variable. But is it some idea about at some end point that whatever healing got to, I guess is what I'm asking you, of what you assume to be all of these other independent variables are actually going to lead to in terms of a final outcome that we would have. Either a cure on the one hand in the biomedical sense, or in your case, it's a psychosocial sense of how I actually am integrated at some point. I guess I'm asking for some kind of precision on whether healing in some particular, not the healing part, but what it actually led to. Did it lead to, have more relationships with people? Did it lead to some sense that I feel better psychologically and I can measure that, or some form of that?
Well, thank you, Martine, and thank you both for these questions that help me think about this more clearly. I have been thinking about it as a process, and definitely distinct from cure. And again, it probably will always be muddy in my brain. It seems to be the way my brain works. I had drinks with a friend a couple years ago who had been successfully cured of bowel cancer, and yet part of why she wanted to meet with me and sit down and have a long conversation in a quiet place was because although she had been cured of her cancer, she had certainly not been healed. And the process that resulted in this goes back to the limits of precision medicine. It's getting cured of cancer is a brutal experience. It's a brutal experience, even with many of our precision therapies. It's hard work. And so I guess I've been thinking about healing as what's shaping this process, and thinking of that as an activity in which clinicians and patients and caregivers are bringing different types of narratives, strategies, and different types of cultural tools. And what are the tools that are going to make that process go more smoothly, recognizing that there's not a single outcome that we're striving for. There's not going to be a measurable, now there's no detectable cancer in one's blood. There's not going to be, now there's no more tumor on one scan. But what makes those processes feel like, at the end of the day, whether you're cured or not, you feel like you have been somehow restored as opposed to sort of exhausted.
We have one last question.
Hi. Thank you, Dan. Your talk really resonates with everything I know on cancer. So thumbs up if you wanted to hear something about that. I'm curious on something you touched on the melanoma paper, but it's more like a methodological issue. So you say that in that paper, you and everyone else, that there are two styles of decision making. One that we call, I don't know the name, active insider, the other one is a reliant outsider. If you put two and two together, you would think that maybe this individualization of care and putting yourself by the bootstrap fits really nicely with the idea of the active insider, the guy who statistically pushes the system and advocates for themselves and is very determined and prosperous, and guess what? They work. But then that makes sense only, and here's where the question comes, if we look at cancer experience or any other medical conditions experience based on the individual. And we both agree in this room that that's not the case, right? Like that all your vignettes had other people around them and they kind of compensated each other. So one was the one waiting, and the other one was the one active, right? Like the sister, the son, the wife, son. So my question is, how would the narrative of your book or of the paper would change if we change the unit of observation, right? What if we really start looking at families or whatever, support networks, rather than just the patient? Because I think it changes everything.
Yeah. Well, Ignacia, knowing some of the things that you think about in some of the work you're doing, I feel like you really teed this one up for me nicely, because I mean, I didn't want to go into it in too much depth, but this is decision-making styles, right? That's what this is. And I think we think of that as being how people experience illness, like what are the decisions they make? And I don't think that's the totality of the experience at all. So I mean, the short answer is I don't know the answer to your question. The longer answer is, if we think about a particular decision and the style with which an individual takes a particular decision, these categories may be more helpful, but we know that the way that illnesses proceed, those kinds of events are very rare. And so it's kind of dumbing down the trajectory of illness to say, let's look at the decisions that people make and see whether they make it by themselves or let other people make it for them. And that's a little bit of it's a shorthand. I think in medicine, it's done all the time, right? There's a tremendous focus on how do we make the decision, as if there's a crucial decision, we arrive at this point. And frankly, one of the issues with the whole cancer patient deliberation study was it was looking at, ostensibly, the money was for, when do people join a clinical trial? As if there's a moment when they join the clinical trial. And of course, the answer is no, that's not how it happens at all. And so I think your question points out both how it's helpful sometimes to, take a particular outcome and be able to focus on it fairly precisely, but also the inherent limitations of that when you're looking at something that's so narratively and longitudinally dynamic as a serious illness.
Emphasis on process helps deal with this.
I think it does, and it also feels like a little bit of a squirrely out. So I'm hoping that maybe it'll be possible to give a better answer to the crucial question that you asked, like, what do I mean by healing? I mean, I've only been working on this project for 15 years, so you got to give me a chance to figure some stuff out.
Well, we must stop now, and I want to thank Professor Dohan for a wonderful presentation.